It was Christmas Eve at Denver International Airport, and nothing felt festive except the artificial glow of red and green lights reflected on exhausted faces. A snowstorm had swallowed the runways hours earlier, and every departure board blinked the same message delayed until further notice. People slept on coats curled on the floor or paced with phones pressed to their ears, whispering apologies to families waiting somewhere else. I was standing near my gate clutching a paper cup of cold coffee when the noise around me shifted, not louder, sharper, the kind of sound that makes your body react before your mind does. A child crying. Not the tired whimper you hear in airports all the time, but a raw, terrified sound that cut through the crowd. I turned and saw airport security moving fast toward a man standing near the wall. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with gray just beginning to touch his hair. He had his hands slightly raised, not in surrender, but confusion. Beside him, a little girl was screaming and clinging to his coat with both hands. One of the officers gently but firmly peeled her fingers away. She fought back with everything her small body had. "No, he is helping me," she cried. "No, no, please." A woman behind me muttered something under her breath that made my stomach tighten. Another man lifted his phone and began recording. The little girl was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. The officer asked the man to step back. "Sir, we need you to cooperate." The man did not argue. He did not shout. He did not explain. He simply stepped where they told him to and let the judgment wash over him in silence. His name, I would learn later, was Daniel. At that moment, he was just a stranger being pulled apart from a child who clearly did not want to let go. The security officer crouched down in front of the girl and asked her a question I will never forget. "Do you know this man?" She nodded violently through tears. Then she looked past the officer straight at Daniel. Her voice cracked, but her words were clear. "Are you lost too, mister?" The entire space seemed to pause. Even the people filming lowered their phones for a second. It was such an innocent question, and yet it landed like a weight. Daniel swallowed hard. He did not answer her. He could not. One of the officers asked again, "Sir, what is your relationship to the child?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "I am just helping her," he said quietly. "She was alone. I did not want her to be scared." The little girl reached for him again. I watched as her fingers trembled in the air where his sleeve had been seconds earlier. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward before I even realized I was moving. "I was standing nearby," I said. I heard everything. She was crying, and he stayed with her. He did not touch her except to kneel so she could see his face. He asked for help. The officer looked at me, then back at Daniel. Another officer spoke into a radio. The crowd leaned in hungry for resolution. The woman who had muttered earlier crossed her arms. The child began to hiccup between sobs. "Her name?" the officer asked gently. "Lila," she whispered. "Where is your mom, Lila?" "She went to get coffee," Lila said. "She told me to wait, but I was cold, so I walked a little and then I could not see her anymore." "How long ago was that?" the officer asked. Lila held up her hand and spread her fingers wide. "A long time. Too long." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. I saw his jaw tighten as if he were holding something back. The airport police supervisor arrived and took over. The situation slowed, but the tension did not. They separated Daniel from Lila by a few feet, close enough to see each other but not to touch. Lila reached out again, and this time Daniel did speak. "I am right here," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She nodded as if she believed him more than anyone else in that place. The supervisor asked for identification. Daniel handed it over without protest. They checked the system. No adult listed with Lila, no unaccompanied minor paperwork, no immediate guardian found in the area. I felt my chest tighten as the words were spoken aloud. The supervisor sighed and looked at Daniel. "Sir, we need to clarify some things. For now, please remain here." Lila began to cry again. She looked at me this time. Her eyes were wide and terrified. I crouched down and took her hand. "You did nothing wrong," I told her. "None of this is your fault." She nodded slowly, but her grip tightened. The supervisor spoke again, and this time his voice carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. There is no adult currently associated with this child in our system. For the moment, she is considered unaccompanied." Daniel exhaled shakily. Lila looked back at him and whispered the same question again, softer now. "Are you lost too, mister?" And in that moment, I realized something terrible and undeniable. Whatever happened next was going to change all of our lives. They moved us a few steps away from the gate into a quieter corner cordoned off by retractable belts that did nothing to block the stairs. The storm outside pressed its weight against the windows, and the airport felt like a sealed container holding too many emotions with nowhere to release them. Daniel stood with his hands clasped in front of him, as if afraid that any sudden movement might confirm the worst assumptions already hanging in the air. Lila stayed close to him without touching, like she had learned some invisible rule in the last few minutes. I stayed beside them both because leaving felt like a betrayal. The supervisor returned after a brief radio exchange and spoke in a measured voice meant to sound calm but heavy with protocol. "Sir, you are not under arrest," he said. "We need to verify the situation before we proceed further." Daniel nodded. "I understand." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. They kept flicking to Lila, then back to the floor, as if he were bracing for something he could not name. A few minutes passed. People drifted away, disappointed that there would be no dramatic takedown. Others lingered, pretending to check their phones while watching us from the edges of their vision. No one apologized. Not the woman who had muttered. Not the man who had filmed. Not even the officer who had pulled Lila away. When the supervisor finally handed Daniel his ID back, he said quietly, "You are free to go, sir. We appreciate your cooperation." Daniel did not move. He looked at Lila instead. She looked up at him like a child waiting for permission to breathe. "Can I stay with her?" he asked. The supervisor hesitated. "For now, yes, but under observation until we locate her mother." I felt a strange mix of relief and anger twist together in my chest. He had been cleared, and yet nothing had been repaired. The accusation had already done its damage. Lila leaned into Daniel, then finally wrapped her arms around his waist. He flinched for a split second, as if worried someone would shout again, but no one did. He rested his hand gently on her back, like he was afraid she might disappear if he pressed too hard. They brought us to a row of chairs near the customer service desk where everything felt painfully normal. Announcements continued. Wheels rattled across tile. Somewhere, a child laughed. The world had moved on while Daniel and Lila were still stuck in the moment where everything had almost gone wrong. I introduced myself properly then. "My name is Claire," I said. Daniel nodded. "Daniel," he replied. "Thank you for speaking up." I did not know what to say to that. It felt like thanking someone for doing the bare minimum of being human. Lila looked up at me. "Are you staying?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I am staying." She nodded as if filing that information away for safety. Time stretched. 15 minutes passed, then 30. An airport employee came by to ask Lila her mother's name again and what she was wearing and where she last saw her. Each question made her shoulders tense. Daniel stayed silent, letting her answer in her own time. When she forgot a detail, he gently filled it in. She said her mom wore a blue coat. He added with a white scarf and brown boots. Lila nodded vigorously. "Yes, the boots that squeak." The employee smiled politely and walked away. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I do not know why she trusts me," he said quietly. "I just sat with her." "Sometimes that is enough," I said. He looked at me then like he was surprised by the idea. The supervisor returned again, this time with a tablet. "No sign of her mother yet," he said. "Restrooms have been checked. Coffee shops, too. We are expanding the search." Lila began to chew on her sleeve. Daniel knelt down so they were eye level. "I am still here," he said. "Remember, I am not going anywhere." She nodded, but her eyes filled anyway. I felt the ache of it deep in my chest. Being cleared did not erase the fear that had already been planted. The suspicion had carved a line that would not fade quickly. Even as the officer stepped back and the tension diffused, Daniel still sat like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. A woman approached hesitantly. She was the same one who had filmed earlier. She lowered her phone. "I am sorry," she said awkwardly. "I did not know." Daniel looked up at her. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply nodded once. She walked away quickly, as if relieved she had done her duty. Lila watched her go. Why did she think you were bad? Lila asked. Daniel paused. He chose his words carefully. Sometimes people are afraid of what they do not understand, he said. Lila frowned. I understand you, she said. That simple statement landed harder than anything else that night. The supervisor returned one last time and spoke words that sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the terminal. If we cannot locate her mother soon, we may need to contact Child Protective Services to ensure the child's safety. Daniel stiffened. Lila froze. I felt the floor tilt slightly under my feet. Lila looked up at Daniel, panic flickering across her face. Are they going to take me? She whispered. Daniel shook his head immediately. No, he said firmly. Not like that. We are just waiting. He looked at the supervisor. How long do we have? He asked. The supervisor hesitated. Not long. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that even though Daniel had been cleared, even though the truth had been spoken, even though I had stood as witness, none of it guaranteed a gentle ending. Justice had stepped in, but healing had not. The night was far from over. The words, Child Protective Services, did not sound cruel when the supervisor said them, but they landed with a quiet finality that made the air feel thinner. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice or plead. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to Lila's level and rested his hands on his knees so she could see them clearly. I am still here, he said again, as if repetition alone could hold the world in place. Lila's eyes darted between his face and the uniformed officer standing a few steps away. Her small fingers twisted the hem of her sweater until the fabric stretched thin. I could see her fighting the kind of fear children do not have words for, the fear that once you are handed to strangers, you may never be returned. The supervisor spoke gently, explaining that CPS was not punishment, but procedure, that their goal was to keep children safe when adults were temporarily unavailable. Lila did not seem to hear any of that. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Daniel's chest. He closed his eyes for a brief second, then wrapped one arm around her shoulders just enough to ground her without drawing attention. I stood beside them, feeling both invisible and unbearably present. A social worker arrived soon after, a woman in her 30s with a soft voice and tired eyes who introduced herself and crouched down to Lila's height. She asked her name again and how old she was and what her favorite color was. Lila answered in short-clipped phrases, still half buried in Daniel's coat. When the social worker asked if Daniel was family, Lila shook her head. Is he your dad? The woman asked. Lila hesitated, then shook her head again. No, she said. But he stayed. The social worker glanced up at Daniel and then at me. Her expression softened slightly. Daniel nodded at her, acknowledging her presence but saying nothing. He did not try to insert himself where he had no claim. That restraint somehow made the situation heavier. The social worker explained that if Lila's mother could not be located soon, a temporary placement would be arranged. Lila's breathing quickened. Daniel's jaw tightened. I watched his hands curl slowly into fists, then relax again, as if he were forcing himself to stay calm for her sake. A man approached hesitantly from the edge of the seating area. He was the same passenger who had earlier crossed his arms and looked away when the situation began. He cleared his throat. I just wanted to say he began, then stopped. He looked at Daniel. I was wrong. I am sorry. Daniel met his gaze. Thank you, he said quietly. The man nodded and left. It was a small moment, but I saw how it affected Daniel. Apologies did not erase the damage, but they mattered. The social worker checked her phone again. Still nothing, she said softly. Lila lifted her head then. Are you going to make me go somewhere else? She asked. The woman paused, choosing her words carefully. We just want to make sure you are safe, she said. Daniel spoke before Lila could spiral further. She is safe right now, he said. His voice was calm, but firm. The social worker nodded. Yes, she is. We are just preparing in case we need to help her for a little while. Lila's face crumpled. Daniel immediately knelt fully this time, bringing himself down so his eyes were level with hers. He placed one hand over his heart. I am not leaving, he said. No matter what happens tonight, I am not walking away from you. Lila searched his face like she was memorizing it. Promise, she asked. Daniel did not say yes right away. I could see him weighing the weight of that word. Then he nodded once. I promise to stay as long as they let me. That was enough. Lila collapsed against him again, and this time he wrapped both arms around her without hesitation. The social worker looked away, giving them a moment. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was not my story to break down in. Minutes ticked by. The airport lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere, an announcement called out a flight number that no longer mattered. Finally, the social worker spoke again. "We are going to give it a little more time," she said. "Airport police are still searching." Daniel exhaled slowly, like he had been holding his breath since the moment Lila cried out. Lila's grip loosened slightly. She leaned back and looked up at him. "You are not lost," she said with certainty. Daniel smiled for the first time since I had seen him, and it was a small, sad thing. "Not right now," he said. "I am right here." I watched them both and realized that whatever paperwork or procedures followed something irreversible had already happened. A connection had been formed not by blood or legality, but by choice. And that terrified me almost as much as it comforted me because I knew how fragile chosen things could be. The supervisor returned again. "We have not located the mother yet," he said. "CPS will remain on standby." Lila's eyes filled again. Daniel squeezed her shoulder gently. "I am still here," he repeated. The words were becoming a lifeline. I thought about how easily this night could have gone another way, how silence or fear or one less witness could have changed everything. Instead, we were suspended in this moment, waiting to see whether kindness would be enough to hold. And as I watched Daniel sit there steady and quiet, while the system circled around him, I understood something clearly for the first time. Being cleared did not mean being safe. It only meant the test had just begun. They escorted us to a small private waiting room just off the main concourse, a space that looked comforting at first glance, with padded chairs, warm lighting, and a low table, but revealed its true purpose the moment the door closed behind us. A camera blinked red in the upper corner, angled carefully to capture every movement. A clipboard rested on the table, already labeled with a case number. The supervisor explained gently that this room allowed privacy while still meeting safety requirements. Daniel nodded and thanked him as if being watched were a courtesy instead of a condition. Lila did not notice the camera at first. She was already curling into Daniel's side, exhaustion finally overpowering fear. He sat down slowly, adjusting his posture so she could rest her head against his shoulder. Her breathing evened out within minutes, small fingers still clutching the fabric of his coat. I sat across from them, watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting breaths like it was something I could control. The door closed again, and for the first time in hours, the noise of the airport dulled to a distant hum. Daniel did not move except to shift slightly when Lila sighed and pressed closer. He stared straight ahead, hands folded loosely in his lap, like a man afraid to disrupt something fragile. I noticed then the corner of something peeking from his coat pocket, a small, worn object with faded colors. He saw my eyes flicker toward it and instinctively covered the pocket with his hand. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Habit." I nodded. "You do not have to explain." He hesitated, then withdrew the object slowly, a little stuffed rabbit with one ear stitched back on in a different color thread. It looked old and loved and completely out of place in an airport holding room. "She dropped it," he said softly. "A long time ago. I keep it with me." I did not ask who she was. Some answers arrive when they are ready. Lila shifted and murmured something in her sleep. Daniel immediately stilled again, adjusting his shoulder to keep her comfortable. The social worker checked in through the door window, giving us a nod. "Still no update," she said apologetically. "We will let you know as soon as we hear anything." Daniel thanked her again. When she left, he let out a breath he had clearly been holding. "I feel like every move I make is being judged," he admitted quietly. I looked up at the camera, then back at him. "It is not you," I said. "It is the system." He gave a small, humorless smile. "That does not make it easier." Time passed in strange fragments. A maintenance cart rattled by outside. An announcement echoed faintly through the walls. Lila slept through it all safe for the moment. Daniel's hand rested lightly on her back, rising and falling with her breath like he was syncing himself to her rhythm. I wondered how long it had been since anyone had needed him like this. The door opened again and an airport police officer stepped in carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate and a blanket. "For the little one," he said. "And for you both." Daniel looked surprised. "Thank you," he said genuinely. The officer placed the blanket gently over Lila and handed 1 cup to Daniel, then glanced at me. There was a softness in his eyes that had not been there earlier. "She is lucky you were here," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "I think I am." The officer nodded and left. Daniel did not drink the hot chocolate right away. He held it between his hands, letting the warmth seep in slowly like he needed proof that something kind had actually happened. Lila stirred and blinked up at him. "You did not leave," she said sleepily. Daniel smiled. "I told you I would stay." She reached for the stuffed rabbit and hugged it to her chest, then closed her eyes again. Daniel's throat worked as he swallowed. I saw his eyes shine in the low light. He looked away, quickly embarrassed. I pretended not to notice. The camera blinked steadily above us, a reminder that this fragile peace was conditional. Eventually, the social worker returned again, this time with a phone pressed to her ear. "We have a possible lead," she said. A woman matching the description was found unresponsive near the restroom by gate 47. "She has been transported to the hospital." Lila's eyes flew open. "Mommy," she whispered. Daniel straightened immediately, every muscle in his body tightening. "Is she okay?" he asked. The social worker shook her head gently. "We do not have medical details yet because of privacy laws, but the description matches. We need to determine next steps." Lila clutched Daniel's coat again, panic returning full force. He wrapped his arm around her without hesitation. "I am here," he whispered. "I am right here." The social worker looked between us. "Would you both be willing to come to the hospital as support witnesses?" she asked. Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes." "Of course." Lila looked up at him. "Are you coming with me?" she asked. Daniel did not look at the camera when he answered. "Yes," he said. "I am coming." I felt my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what was forming between them under fluorescent lights and surveillance. This was not a family in any official sense. There were no papers, no promises, no guarantees. Just a man, a child, and a choice being made again and again in the smallest ways. As we stood to leave, Daniel tucked the rabbit carefully back into his pocket and lifted Lila gently into his arms. She rested her head against his shoulder, already half asleep again, trusting him completely. The camera watched as we exited the room, capturing the moment like evidence. I wondered if anyone reviewing that footage later would understand what it was really recording. Not a liability, not a risk, but the quiet beginning of something that could not be undone. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, a scent that always carried urgency and waiting in equal measure. And as we followed the nurse down the corridor, I felt the air change around us, as if every step pulled us farther from the noise of the airport and deeper into something fragile and uncertain. Lila clung to Daniel's neck, her small fingers gripping the collar of his coat, while he held her with a careful steadiness, like he was afraid one wrong move might shatter the moment. The nurse explained calmly that a woman had collapsed near the restroom by gate 47, likely from exhaustion and exposure. EMTs had responded quickly, but she arrived without identification and had not regained consciousness yet. Because she was listed as Jane Doe, no information could be shared beyond confirmation of admission. Daniel listened without interrupting, nodding once in acknowledgement, while Lila whispered Mommy into the fabric of his coat as if saying it enough times might carry through walls. We stopped outside a glass partition that looked into a dim ICU room, machines humming softly, lights low, and there on the bed lay a woman pale and still. Her hair damp, strands clinging to her forehead like she had been caught in the snow moments before, being pulled inside. Even without seeing her face clearly, Lila reacted instantly. She pressed her palm flat against the glass and let out a sound that was half breath, half sob. "That is her," she said with certainty, the kind only children have when they know something in their bones. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again and rested his free hand against the glass beside hers, a silent promise of presence rather than answers. The doctor stepped in quietly and spoke to us in low, measured tones, explaining that the woman was suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and exhaustion. She had likely been pushing herself for days, maybe weeks before her body gave out. She was stable now but unconscious, and it could take time for her to wake. Lila listened to none of it, her focus locked on the still form beyond the glass. She leaned her forehead against the window and whispered, "I waited, Mommy," like she was reporting on a task she had completed. Daniel's breath hitched and he looked away, his jaw tight. I realized then that he was apologizing silently, not to the woman in the bed, but to someone else. Someone absent whose loss still lived in him. The doctor asked gently who Daniel was to the child, and he answered honestly, "A stranger who stayed." The doctor nodded as if that was explanation enough. A social worker joined us moments later, clipboard in hand, eyes kind but firm, explaining procedures and possibilities that no child should have to hear. Yet, Lila heard them anyway. Fragments of words like guardian, temporary placement, next steps. When the social worker asked if there was anyone else Lila could stay with if her mother did not wake, Daniel stiffened but said nothing. Lila looked up at him, then back at the social worker and said, "He stays with me." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact in her world. The social worker paused, taken aback, then smiled softly and said, "We will talk about that, okay?" Lila nodded, satisfied, and returned her attention to the glass. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of responsibility settling without ceremony. We were given a small waiting area nearby, and Lila was allowed to sit on a chair facing the door of the ICU room so she could feel close. Daniel sat beside her, his arm around her back, steady grounding. He pulled the stuffed rabbit from his pocket and placed it in her lap. She hugged it tightly and whispered, "Mommy likes bunnies." He nodded, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. Time moved strangely. There measured not in minutes, but in the rise and fall of hope. Nurses passed quietly, monitors beeped softly, and every so often someone glanced at us with curiosity, then understanding. Daniel barely spoke, but when he did, his voice was low and careful, as if loud words might disturb the fragile balance holding everything together. He told Lila she was brave. She corrected him and said, "No, Mommy is brave." He smiled faintly. "Yes," he agreed. "She is." At one point, a nurse brought juice and crackers, and Lila ate mechanically, never taking her eyes off the door. Daniel encouraged her gently, and she obeyed because she trusted him. I watched this trust grow not from grand gestures, but from consistency. From him staying when leaving would have been easier. The social worker returned with updates minimal, but enough to keep us anchored. The woman remained stable. No change yet. Lila's eyelids grew heavy, and she leaned fully into Daniel's side, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. He adjusted instinctively, cradling her head against his chest, and she slept. In that moment, he looked nothing like a man under suspicion, nothing like a stranger in the wrong place. He looked like what he was becoming, someone who had chosen to stay. I caught his eye, and he gave a small nod as if acknowledging a truth neither of us needed to say aloud. The camera was gone. Here, no blinking light, no silent judgment, just people and choices. When the doctor finally emerged again, his expression was cautiously hopeful. "She stirred," he said briefly. "It may still take time, but she responded to stimuli." Lila woke instantly at the word stirred, lifting her head. "Can I see her?" she asked. "Not yet," the doctor said kindly, "but soon." Lila nodded, satisfied with soon, and leaned back into Daniel once more. He closed his eyes, resting his cheek against her hair, and for the first time since this began, I saw him allow himself to feel relief, however tentative. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in quiet, while inside, a woman without a name was slowly being remembered by the world through the eyes of her child. I understood then that Jane Doe was not invisible. She was waiting, and so were we. Nothing was resolved not yet, but something had shifted irreversibly. A stranger was no longer just a stranger, a child was no longer alone, and a choice made under fluorescent lights was beginning to ripple outward in ways none of us could fully grasp. The ICU corridor was quiet in the way only hospitals could manage a hush that was not peaceful but careful, as if every sound had learned to lower its voice out of respect for what was happening behind closed doors. We were allowed to stand just beyond the threshold this time, not touching, not entering, but close enough to see her clearly. The glass reflected our faces faintly layered over hers, a strange merging of past and present. Lila stood on tiptoe, pressing her hands to the window, her breath fogging the surface. "Mommy," she whispered again, softer now. Not demanding, not pleading, just letting the word exist. The doctor explained in a calm, even tone that her mother had responded slightly to stimuli, her body fighting its way back after being pushed too far for too long. "Severe dehydration, hypothermia, and exhaustion," he said again, as if repetition might help us understand the cost. Daniel listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving the woman in the bed. I noticed his hand tightening slowly around the stuffed rabbit he had kept hidden again, like it was grounding him to something solid. Lila asked if her mother was cold, and when the doctor said no, she is warm now. Lila nodded satisfied and said, "Good, she does not like being cold." Daniel inhaled sharply at that, a small detail cutting deeper than any diagnosis. The nurse adjusted a monitor inside the room, and the soft beep changed rhythm just enough to make Lila gasp. Daniel dropped to one knee, instantly bringing himself level with her. "It is okay," he whispered. "She is still here." Lila nodded, gripping his sleeve with both hands. The social worker joined us again, her presence both reassuring and heavy with implications. She explained that because Lila's mother was unconscious and unidentified, formal custody could not yet be established. Temporary arrangements would need to be made if the situation extended. Lila did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her body tensed and she pressed closer to Daniel. He did not pull away. Instead, he placed his hand over hers and said, "I am not leaving." The social worker paused, then nodded slowly, acknowledging the boundary he had drawn without hostility. "We will take things step by step," she said. Daniel nodded back, equally calm. I realized then that he was no longer reacting to events, he was choosing how to stand within them. Time stretched again, hours folding into themselves. Lila grew restless, then quiet, then restless again, riding the waves of uncertainty the way only children could. Daniel talked to her in low tones, telling her about the snow outside, about the airport trains she liked to watch, about how sometimes people got very tired and needed help resting. He did not lie. He did not promise outcomes. He stayed in the present with her, and it was enough. At one point, he rested his forehead against the glass and whispered an apology meant only for the woman inside. "I am sorry you had to do this alone," he said so quietly, I almost missed it. Lila looked up at him and said, "Mommy is strong." He smiled faintly and nodded. "Yes," he agreed. "She is." A nurse came out and motioned for us to step closer. She squeezed Lila's shoulder gently and said, "You can talk to her. Sometimes people can hear even when they cannot respond." Lila leaned forward, her small voice steady as she spoke. "Mommy." "I waited," she said. "I did not cry much. Daniel stayed with me. You can rest now. I am here." The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking once before he steadied himself again. I felt my own chest tighten, a strange mix of grief and grace colliding in that narrow space. The nurse nodded approvingly and stepped back. The social worker looked at Daniel, then at me, then back at Lila. She cleared her throat and said gently, "We will need to talk about plans soon." Daniel did not flinch. "I know," he said. "We will talk." Lila turned to him, eyes wide. "You are staying, right?" she asked. He did not hesitate. "I am here," he said again. "As long as you need." She nodded satisfied and leaned against him, her body finally relaxing. I noticed then that his hand was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the promise he was making without legal standing, without certainty, without expectation of reward. It was a promise of presence only, and it was costing him more than anything he had given before. The doctor returned briefly to explain that her mother's condition remained stable, but critical time would tell how quickly she recovered. He emphasized again that exhaustion had pushed her body beyond its limits. Lila listened, then said softly, "Mommy works a lot." Daniel's jaw tightened. The doctor nodded solemnly. "Too many do," he said. After he left, Daniel remained kneeling beside Lila, his posture protective and unwavering. I realized then that the injustice we had witnessed earlier had not ended at the airport gate. It had simply shifted locations, revealing itself in quieter, more systemic ways. A woman collapsed unseen, a child nearly separated a man judged for standing still. The wrongness of it all pressed down heavy and undeniable. Lila rested her head against Daniel's shoulder again, her eyes fluttering closed. He wrapped his arm around her carefully and looked up at me. "I did not expect this," he admitted quietly. I nodded. "None of us did." He swallowed. "I lost someone once," he said after a pause. "A child." He did not elaborate, and I did not ask. The words hung between us, heavy and sacred. Lila stirred and murmured his name, mispronounced but unmistakable. He smiled at the sound, then leaned his cheek against her hair. Outside the ICU window, the lights dimmed slightly as evening approached and snow continued to fall, turning the city white and still. Inside, nothing was resolved, not yet, but the truth had made itself known. Pain does not announce itself with sirens. It slips in quietly when no one is looking and asks too much of those least able to give. But sometimes someone stays, and sometimes that staying is enough to begin again. Night settled over the hospital, slowly, not announced by darkness, but by a thinning of voices and a softening of movement, as if everyone inside had agreed without speaking to handle the hours more gently. Lila slept curled against Daniel on a narrow bench, her legs tucked beneath her, his coat wrapped around both of them like a makeshift shelter. I sat a few feet away, watching the hallway lights reflect off the polished floor, thinking about how many lives crossed this place every day and how rarely they truly touched. Daniel stared straight ahead, his face drawn but calm, the kind of calm that came from exhaustion rather than peace. After a long silence, he spoke quietly, not looking at me. "I used to sit in places like this," he said. "Different hospitals, same smell." I waited for him to continue without interrupting. He swallowed once. "My son," he added. "He was 5. Lila shifted in her sleep at the sound of his voice, and Daniel instinctively lowered it further. "He got sick fast," Daniel went on. "There were signs, but I was busy. Always one more meeting, one more flight, one more promise to show up later." He exhaled slowly. Later never came. The words did not tremble, but they landed with weight. I felt my chest tighten, but said nothing. He deserved space to place the truth somewhere outside himself. When he died, Daniel continued quietly. "I stopped trusting myself around children. I told myself it was safer for everyone. That distance was responsibility." He glanced down at Lila, then back ahead. "Tonight proved me wrong." I nodded. "Sometimes distance looks like safety until it becomes abandonment." He gave a small, sad smile. "Exactly." Lila stirred again, murmuring something unintelligible. Daniel brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, the motion practiced though he had likely not done it in years. She relaxed instantly. He closed his eyes briefly like he was committing the sensation to memory. The social worker approached again, clipboard tucked under her arm, her expression softer than before. She spoke carefully, explaining that if Lila's mother did not regain consciousness within a certain window, they would need to initiate temporary placement procedures. It would be short-term, she emphasized, with regular visitation once medically appropriate. Daniel listened without reacting, then asked one question. Would she be alone tonight? The social worker hesitated, then said, "No. We would place her in emergency care with a trained foster provider." Daniel nodded once. Lila heard the word foster and her eyes flew open, panic immediate and raw. "No," she said, grabbing Daniel's sleeve. "I stay here." Daniel turned to the social worker, his voice steady but firm. "She is not alone right now," he said. "I am here." The social worker held his gaze. "We appreciate that," she said, "but we must follow protocol." Lila pressed her face into Daniel's chest, crying silently, her body rigid with fear. Daniel wrapped his arms around her fully now. No hesitation, no restraint. He rested his chin on her head and whispered, "I am not leaving." The social worker paused, watching the interaction, then sighed softly. "Let me see what flexibility we have," she said. She stepped away, leaving the clipboard on the counter like an unresolved question. Daniel rocked Lila gently the way parents did in quiet rooms when there were no answers. I realized then that the system, though necessary, often arrived too late to catch the truth already forming. Lila's breathing slowed again, but her grip did not loosen. She did not trust the words spoken by adults, she trusted the arms holding her. After some time, Daniel spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I never told anyone this," he said, not because it was a secret, but because saying it made it real. "I was afraid that if I let another child need me, I would fail again." I met his eyes. "And tonight?" he exhaled. "Tonight I stayed." Lila shifted and looked up at him, eyes heavy with sleep. "You stayed," she repeated like confirmation. He smiled softly. "Yes." She nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes again. The social worker returned after a while, her expression different this time, resolved. "We can document temporary support," she said, "as long as you understand it is not custody and remains under supervision." Daniel nodded immediately. "I understand. Thank you." She added his name to the file and noted his willingness to remain on site. The pen scratched across the paper a small sound marking a quiet but significant decision. When she left, Daniel leaned back against the wall, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I did not know I could do this," he admitted. "Sometimes we do not until we have to," I replied. He looked down at Lila, then back at the corridor leading to the ICU. "I cannot promise anything," he said. "I know I said. But you are here. That matters." A nurse passed by and smiled at the sight of them. "You look like you belong here," she said kindly, then moved on. Daniel chuckled softly. "Belong," he repeated, tasting the word. He adjusted his coat around Lila again, ensuring she was warm. Outside the window, the snow had slowed falling in gentle flakes like the world was exhaling. Inside, something fragile and honest had been spoken aloud, and once spoken could not be taken back. The gap Daniel had carried for years now had a shape and a name and a small sleeping child resting against his heart. He did not know where this would lead, none of us did, but the confession had opened a door, and through it, something human and hopeful was beginning to step forward. Morning crept into the hospital without ceremony, the lights in the corridor shifting slightly as night staff handed off to day staff, and the world resumed its careful movement around those still caught in waiting. Lila woke slowly, her body stiff from sleeping upright, her first instinct to reach for Daniel, and when she found him still there, her shoulders relaxed in visible relief. He smiled at her and whispered good morning like it was something sacred. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward the ICU doors immediately. "Is Mommy awake?" she asked. "Not yet," Daniel said gently, "but she is resting." Lila nodded, then slid off his lap and stood beside him, holding his hand as if that was simply where it belonged now. The social worker returned with a fresh cup of coffee for Daniel and a small carton of milk for Lila. She spoke softly, updating us that there was no significant change yet, but the medical team remained cautiously hopeful. Lila listened quietly, then looked up at her and asked a question that stopped the room cold. "Can Daniel stay with me if Mommy does not wake up?" The words were clear, not whispered, not rushed, not confused. A simple question asked at the wrong time in the wrong place with devastating honesty. The social worker froze, her practiced expression slipping for just a second before she recovered. Daniel went completely still, his hand tightening around Lila's. I felt the air thicken around us like the room itself was holding its breath. The social worker knelt in front of Lila, trying to soften the answer. "That is something grown-ups have to talk about," she said carefully. Lila frowned. "But he stays," she insisted. "He promised." Daniel swallowed hard and dropped to one knee beside her, his voice unsteady for the first time since I had met him. "I am here," he said again, but this time the words shook. "I am here." Lila studied his face, searching for something only she could see, then nodded, satisfied. "Okay," she said simply, and leaned against him. That was when Daniel broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, helpless way that felt more intimate than tears ever could. He pressed his forehead against Lila's hair and let out a sob he could not stop, his shoulders shaking as years of restraint finally gave way. I turned slightly, giving him privacy, pretending to check my phone while staying close enough to be present. The social worker stood and stepped back, her eyes glistening. The nurse at the station looked over, sensing the shift, and lowered her voice when speaking to a colleague. Daniel breathed through it slowly, grounding himself against the small weight in his arms. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red but clear. "I am sorry," he said to no one in particular. Lila looked up confused. "Why sorry?" she asked. He smiled weakly. "I just forgot how much I cared," he admitted. She considered that, then said, "I remember." He laughed softly through tears and hugged her again. The doctor emerged shortly after updating us that Lila's mother remained stable but still unconscious. The uncertainty pressed down again, but something had changed in Daniel. The question Lila had asked had not been answered, but it had been heard, and that was enough to shift the ground beneath his feet. Later, as Lila colored quietly on scrap paper, Daniel turned to me and spoke with a resolve that startled me. "I am not leaving," he said. "I do not care what flights I miss, what meetings I cancel. I am staying until this is resolved." I nodded. "That is a big decision," I said. He shook his head. "It feels like the smallest one I have made in years." The social worker returned with forms explaining temporary support arrangements, and Daniel signed them without hesitation, reading every line but not wavering. It was not custody, not adoption, not anything permanent, but it was presence documented and allowed. Lila watched him sign and asked what he was doing. "Staying," he answered. She smiled and returned to her drawing, satisfied. Hours passed slowly, punctuated by updates and quiet meals eaten standing up. Daniel stayed close, never leaving Lila's side, even when encouraged to take a break. He paced with her when she grew restless, sat with her when she grew quiet, and listened, when she asked questions no one else could answer. At one point, she asked if Mommy would be mad if she stayed with him, and he said, "No, because she loves you, and people who love you want you safe." She nodded, absorbing that truth like a seed. As evening approached, the nurse brought news that Lila's mother had opened her eyes briefly, then fallen asleep again. Lila gasped and clutched Daniel's hand. "She knows I am here," she said with certainty. Daniel nodded, his voice thick. "Yes," he said. "She knows." I watched them from a short distance away, struck by the quiet courage of a child who asked the question no adult wanted to hear, and a man who chose to answer not with words, but with action. The injustice that had brought them together still lingered unresolved, but innocence had cut through it, demanding something better. Daniel looked at me once more and said quietly, "Whatever happens next, I am not going back to who I was." I believed him. The viral moment was not the accusation at the airport, or the questions from authorities, or even the hospital drama. It was a child asking the wrong question at the right time and a man choosing to let it change him. That choice once made could not be undone. The decision to stay did not arrive with speeches or dramatic gestures. It arrived quietly in the way Daniel moved his bag closer to the wall, like he would not need it for a while, and in the way he asked the nurse where the nearest vending machine was instead of the exit. He called the airline and canceled his flight without stepping away from Lila's side, his voice calm and final. When he hung up, he exhaled like someone setting down a weight he had carried for too long. Lila watched him with careful attention, then asked, "Are we still here?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, we are staying." She considered that, then smiled and went back to arranging her crayons. The hospital accepted the choice without fanfare. Paperwork moved from one desk to another. Signatures collected, notes added. Temporary support under supervision. The words were precise and limited, but they opened space for something human to exist. I signed as a witness where needed and stayed as well because leaving felt like a betrayal of the moment. There was no romance, no expectation, just a shared understanding that turning away now would undo something fragile and true. The nurse offered a small room nearby where Lila could rest more comfortably, and Daniel thanked her like she had handed him a miracle. He carried Lila down the hallway, her arms looped around his neck, her head resting against his shoulder like it had always belonged there. He tucked her into the narrow bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and sat on the edge until her breathing slowed. I stood in the doorway, watching the quiet ritual, the way he brushed her hair back and whispered that he would be right outside. She nodded, already half asleep, trusting him completely. When he stepped out, he leaned against the wall, rubbing his face with both hands. I asked if he was okay. He nodded slowly. I am terrified, he admitted. I smiled gently. That usually means you are doing something right. He laughed softly. I have no idea what I am doing, he said. I shook my head. You are staying. That is enough for today. The social worker returned to inform us that Lila's mother had regained partial consciousness and was asking for her daughter. Daniel stiffened immediately, his jaw tightening. He asked if they could see her and was told soon, but preparations needed to be made. Lila woke when she heard Mommy whispered through the door. She sat up suddenly, panic flickering, until Daniel stepped in and held her hands. She wants to see you, he said gently. Lila nodded and hugged him tight, then asked, Are you coming? He paused just a fraction of a second, then said, Yes, I am coming. We walked down the corridor together slower this time, the air thick with anticipation. The nurse opened the door to the ICU room and allowed Lila to step inside first, with Daniel just behind her. Her mother lay propped slightly awake but weak, her eyes unfocused at first, then sharpening when they landed on her child. Lila gasped and ran forward, stopping just short of the bed like she had been taught. Mommy, she cried. The woman's face crumpled with relief and confusion. Lila, she whispered, reaching out. The nurse helped guide Lila closer, and she took her mother's hand carefully. Daniel stayed back, giving space, his hands clenched at his sides. The woman's eyes flicked to him, confusion replacing relief. Who is that? She asked weakly. Lila turned and pointed. Daniel, she said simply. He stayed. The woman's gaze sharpened to suspicion, flickering. Daniel stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible. I am sorry, he said quietly. I was with her at the airport when you collapsed. I did not know how to reach you. I stayed. The woman's brow furrowed, fear and gratitude colliding. You stayed, she repeated, uncertain. Daniel nodded. I did not leave her. The nurse intervened gently, explaining the situation and the protocols and the temporary support arrangement. The woman listened, tears slipping down her temples as understanding settled in. She looked at Daniel again, this time differently. Thank you, she whispered. Lila squeezed her hand. He promised not to leave, she said proudly. The woman closed her eyes briefly and nodded. Thank you, she repeated. Daniel bowed his head slightly. It was nothing he said, but his voice betrayed him. Outside the room, he leaned against the wall again, overwhelmed. I stood beside him. That could have gone very differently, I said softly. He nodded. I know. But it did not. That mattered. Later paperwork was updated and the immediate crisis eased. Lila returned to her small room exhausted but lighter. Daniel sat with her until she slept again, his presence steady. I realized then that choosing to stay did not require permission. It required courage. Daniel had not claimed a role or a title. He had simply refused to disappear. As night fell again and the hospital settled into its quieter rhythm, I saw him glance at his phone, then turn it face down, uninterested in whatever waited beyond these walls. He looked at Lila sleeping and smiled faintly. I do not know what happens next, he said quietly. I nodded. None of us do. He exhaled. But I am here. And for the first time since this began, that felt like an ending and a beginning at the same time. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, spoken softly between nurses' rounds and pauses for breath as Lila's mother gathered strength and words in equal measure. Her name was Clara. She told us eventually, her voice thin but steady, and she apologized first before anything else, as if collapsing were a personal failure. I am sorry, she said to Lila, and then to Daniel, and then to me, like the order mattered. I just needed to sit down for a minute. I did not mean to scare anyone. Lila climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed and shook her head. You did not scare me, she said. I waited. Clara closed her eyes and tears slid sideways into her hair. Daniel stayed where he was near the door, hands folded, letting Clara lead the moment. When she looked at him again, there was a question in her eyes and fear behind it. I do not understand how this happened, she said. Daniel nodded. You collapsed near the restroom by the gate, he said gently. There was a storm. You were exhausted. You did nothing wrong. Clara exhaled shakily. I work nights, she said. 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when I can get them. I clean offices and stock shelves. I sleep when Lila sleeps. I just needed coffee before boarding. I thought I had time. The doctor nodded, confirming the timeline. Severe exhaustion, he said again. It builds quietly. Clara listened, then laughed weakly. Quietly, she repeated. That sounds right. She looked at Daniel again. You stayed with her, she said, not accusing now, just trying to understand. He nodded. Yes. She gripped the blanket. She has not smiled like this since her father left, she said, suddenly surprising all of us. Lila looked up. Mommy, do not be sad, she said. I have Daniel. Clara's breath caught. Daniel stepped forward just enough to be present without intruding. Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Thank you, she said simply. Not for staying, not for anything heroic, but for treating her child like someone worth staying for. Daniel bowed his head slightly. I only did what anyone should, he replied. Clara shook her head. Not everyone does, she said. The hospital social worker joined us, then explaining the next steps and timelines with a gentler tone than before. Temporary supervision would remain until Clara was discharged and follow-up care arranged. Daniel listened carefully, then asked if there were any programs that supported children during transitions. The social worker blinked, surprised, then said, There is a mentoring program affiliated with the hospital and community center. We often struggle to find consistent volunteers. Daniel nodded. I can help, he said. Clara looked at him startled. You do not have to, she said. I want to, he replied. I used to fund programs like that, he added quietly. I never showed up. The social worker smiled. Showing up matters, she said. Lila tugged Daniel's sleeve. Will you come see me? She asked. He smiled softly. If you want me to. She nodded enthusiastically. Clara watched them, something easing in her shoulders. Later, when the room emptied and Clara slept, Daniel and I sat in the waiting area again, the weight of crisis lifting just enough to allow reflection. I asked him what had changed. He thought for a long moment. I spent years believing the right thing was distance, he said. That being careful meant being absent. Tonight taught me that absence hurts more. I nodded. The injustice you faced at the airport could have sent you away, I said. He smiled faintly. It almost did. But Lila asked me to stay, and I listened. We returned briefly to Clara's room when she woke again, and she reached for Daniel's hand, surprising him. I was afraid when they thought you might take her, she said quietly. Daniel stiffened. I would never, she began, then stopped. He nodded. I know, he said, but I also know why you were afraid. She squeezed his hand weakly. Thank you for not being angry, she said. He smiled sadly. Anger would have been easier, he admitted. Gratitude was harder. As evening approached, discharge planning began, and Clara's strength improved visibly. Lila colored pictures and taped one to the wall, a stick figure family with herself in the middle holding two hands. Daniel noticed but said nothing. When a nurse commented on it, Lila said proudly, Daniel is my helper. Daniel felt something break open at that, not grief this time, but permission. Permission to accept gratitude without deflecting it. Permission to step into a role without owning it. Before leaving the room, Clara looked at Daniel again. I do not know how to repay you, she said. He shook his head. You already did, he replied. She frowned, confused. By letting me stay, he said. The words settled between them, heavy and true. As we walked back into the corridor, Daniel looked lighter, not relieved, but aligned, like he had chosen a direction that finally made sense. I realized then that success did not always arrive as achievement. Sometimes it arrived as being allowed to matter. Healing did not arrive with sudden relief or dramatic change. It arrived quietly in routines and repetitions, in the way Daniel showed up the next morning with coffee for the nurses and a small notebook where he wrote down names so he would remember them. Clara was stronger now, able to sit up without assistance, her voice steadier each time she spoke. Lila bounced between the bed and the small play area outside the room, her laughter returning in cautious bursts, like a sound testing whether it was safe to exist again. Daniel stayed nearby, not hovering, not retreating, just present in the background where support often mattered most. The social worker returned to outline follow-up steps, and Daniel listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions not about credit or recognition, but about continuity and stability. When the mentoring program coordinator arrived later that afternoon, Daniel stood to greet her like it was an honor rather than an obligation. She explained the program served children who had lost a parent or experienced long-term separation, pairing them with consistent adult figures who committed time, not money. Daniel nodded. "Time I can give," he said simply. I watched the coordinator's expression soften, recognizing sincerity when she saw it. Lila tugged on Daniel's sleeve and asked if he would read to her later. He smiled and said, "Yes, if your mom says it is okay." Clara nodded immediately. "Please," she said. "I think she listens better when you read." Daniel looked surprised, then smiled. That evening, he sat beside Lila's bed, reading slowly, his voice warm and steady, stumbling over character voices and laughing when Lila corrected him. Clara watched from her bed, tears gathering quietly not from fear this time, but from relief. Later, when Lila slept, Clara reached for Daniel's hand again. "You do not owe us this," she said. He shook his head. "I know," he replied. "That is why it matters." The hospital discharged Clara 2 days later with clear instructions and follow-up appointments arranged. Daniel helped carry their bags, walking beside them as they left the building into sunlight that felt new. There were no reporters, no cameras, no applause, just a quiet group stepping forward together. Outside, the snow had melted into slush, evidence that storms eventually passed, even when they felt endless. At the curb, Clara turned to Daniel, uncertain. "I do not know what comes next," she admitted. He nodded. "Neither do I," he said, "but you will not have to figure it out alone." She looked at him, searching his face, then smiled. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. Lila ran ahead, then turned back. "You are coming?" she asked. Daniel paused, then said, "I will walk with you for a bit." She grinned, satisfied. In the weeks that followed, Daniel kept his word. He showed up for mentoring sessions, sitting on the floor with children who tested him and trusted him in equal measure. He did not fix them. He listened. He learned. He stood where he was needed and nowhere else. Clara settled into recovery, balancing rest and work with cautious determination. She and I spoke often now, sharing quiet moments while Lila played nearby. One afternoon, Clara said I thought the worst thing that could happen was being alone. I was wrong. The worst thing was thinking no one would stay. I nodded. Daniel was across the room helping a child build a tower of blocks, his laughter unguarded. He looked like someone standing exactly where he belonged. Lila waved him over, and he came without hesitation. When she asked if he would come again next week, he said yes without checking a calendar. I realized then that healing did not mean erasing what had happened. It meant standing in the aftermath and choosing differently. Daniel had not become a savior or a father or anything that needed naming. He had become reliable, and sometimes that was the rarest gift of all. As we prepared to leave the center that evening, Lila took Daniel's hand and I walked beside them. Clara followed, smiling, tired but hopeful. We stepped into the cool air together, no longer bound by crisis, but connected by choice. Daniel glanced at me and said quietly, "I am glad you spoke up that night." I shook my head. "I am glad you stayed." The words felt complete. The healing had not been loud, but it had been real, and it was enough. The morning we left the hospital for the last time, the sky was clear in that sharp winter way that made every breath feel earned. Sunlight reflected off the wet pavement where snow had melted, leaving behind small mirrors of light that caught Lila's attention as she hopped from one to the next, holding Daniel's hand and narrating each step like an adventure. Clara walked beside us, slower still, rebuilding strength, but steadier with every step. There was no announcement, no moment where anyone declared what we were to one another. And yet something had already settled into place. We did not hurry. We did not linger. We simply walked together out into the day. At the curb, Daniel paused instinctively, waiting for direction. Clara smiled faintly and gestured forward. "Come with us," she said, not as an invitation, but as an assumption. He nodded once and stepped in beside her. Lila squeezed both their hands, her small fingers linking two lives that had once been strangers. We stopped at a quiet cafe not far from the hospital, the kind that smelled like toast and fresh coffee, and offered warmth without asking questions. Lila claimed a booth immediately, dragging Daniel in beside her, while Clara and I sat across watching the way he listened to Lila's story about the reflections on the sidewalk as if it mattered deeply. It did. The waitress brought extra napkins and smiled knowingly. As we ate, Clara spoke softly about plans and uncertainties about work and recovery and how everything still felt fragile. Daniel listened and said nothing unnecessary. When she finished, he said, "We will take it one step at a time." She nodded, relieved, not because he had answers, but because he did not pretend to. After breakfast, Daniel walked them home carrying Lila's backpack and stopping every few steps when she pointed out something new. At the door, Clara turned to him hesitant. "You do not have to keep doing this," she said quietly. He smiled gently. "I know," he replied. She studied him, then stepped aside. Lila ran inside, calling his name. He followed without hesitation. Weeks passed and routines formed, not rigid but reliable. Daniel attended mentoring sessions twice a week and sometimes stayed longer listening to children who needed someone to stay past the scheduled time. Clara recovered, fully returning to work with a renewed steadiness. Lila thrived, her laughter freer, her questions bolder. And Daniel remained a constant presence, not filling a role, but occupying space honestly. One afternoon, we gathered at the community center for a small winter event, children decorating paper stars and hanging them from strings. Lila tugged Daniel forward, insisting he help her hang one. When he lifted her to reach, she whispered something in his ear, and he laughed, nodding. Later, I asked what she had said. He smiled. "She asked if stars ever get lost," he replied. "And what did you tell her I asked?" He looked thoughtful. "That they do sometimes," he said, "but they still shine." As the event ended, families drifted away and the room grew quiet. Clara approached Daniel, holding a paper star with Lila's name written in careful letters. She handed it to him. "For you," she said. He accepted it carefully, like it was something fragile. "Thank you," he said simply. Lila ran up, then wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his coat. "You stayed," she said again, as if it were a title. He closed his eyes briefly and hugged her back. "Yes," he said. "I stayed." I watched them, knowing then that this was the ending, not because everything was resolved, but because something essential had been chosen. No one needed to define it or name it or promise what came next. The family forming here was not built on blood or paperwork or obligation. It was built on presence, on the refusal to look away, on the courage to answer a child's question honestly with action. As we stepped outside the center together, the air felt lighter, the kind of cold that sharpened rather than numbed. Lila yawned and leaned against Daniel, her head resting naturally on his side. Clara walked close enough that their shoulders brushed. I lagged a step behind, watching the way they moved now unconsciously in rhythm. I thought back to the airport, the accusation, the cameras, the injustice that had ignited this path. I had believed I was stepping forward to defend a stranger and protect a child, but the truth revealed itself quietly over time. Their courage had reopened something in me too, a belief that kindness was not naive, that staying mattered, and that family could be formed not by fate but by choice. As we reached the corner, Clara looked back at me. "Thank you," she said simply. I shook my head, smiling. "I am just glad I did not walk away." Daniel glanced over then and met my eyes. "Me too," he said. Lila looked between us, confused, then laughed. "Are we going home now?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said, "we are." And as they turned toward the street, the winter sun rising higher behind them, I understood that home was not a place we arrived at. It was something we chose again and again by staying. Maybe what stayed with you most was not the moment in the airport or the hospital or even the quiet way they walked out into the winter morning together. Maybe it was something smaller, the way a child slept without fear once someone chose to stay. The way a man realized too late does not always mean never. Or maybe it was the feeling you had when the story ended, and you noticed you were still sitting there, still thinking, still holding on to something you could not quite name. Stories like this do not linger because they are dramatic. They linger because they are familiar. Because somewhere in your life there was a moment when you could have stayed or wished someone else had. Because many of us have walked through seasons where being strong meant being silent, and being responsible meant being alone. And maybe you told yourself that chapter was over, that caring deeply was something you did when you were younger, before loss taught you to be careful. But this story asks a quiet question. What if the most important thing you can still do is not fix anything, not rescue anyone, not make up for the past, but simply stay when it matters? Daniel did not change the world. He did not undo what happened to him. He did not erase grief or injustice or exhaustion. He chose presence over distance. And that choice changed the shape of several lives, including his own. If you have ever felt invisible while doing your best, if you have ever carried responsibility without recognition, if you have ever believed you missed your chance to matter again, this story was not just about them. It was about you, too. About the moments we think are small that turn out to be everything. About how family does not always arrive the way we expect, and healing rarely announces itself. Sometimes it comes quietly disguised as inconvenience or interruption, or a child asking the wrong question at the wrong time. And sometimes the bravest thing is answering that question honestly with your actions. If this story stirred something in you, let it sit. You do not need to rush past it. Let yourself remember the parts of you that once believed staying mattered, the parts that still do. And if you are looking for more stories like this, stories that do not shout but stay, stories about ordinary people making one human choice that changes everything, then you are already in the right place. By choosing to watch until the end, you chose presence too. By staying with this story, you became part of it. And if you want to keep walking alongside stories that honor quiet courage, second chances, and the families we choose rather than inherit, then staying a little longer might be the simplest and most meaningful choice you make today. Subscribe not because you are told to, but because something here felt familiar. Because these stories do not ask you to be perfect. They ask you to be human. And sometimes that is enough to begin again.